A black businessman disguises himself as an employee to understand his team's challenges, but ends up being humiliated. What no one expected was the shocking twist when he finally reveals himself. The fluorescent lights above buzzed like a swarm of angry bees, their sterile, cold glow casting sharp shadows on the walls of the office. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the faint scent of printer ink, a combination that once felt familiar but now only served to heighten the tension in Henry's chest. He stood at the far corner of the room, watching quietly as employees bustled around, absorbed in their tasks. His heart pounded, not from exertion, but from the tight grip of humiliation creeping in with every second that passed. He wasn't supposed to be here, he wasn't supposed to feel this way. But today, he was no longer Henry, the powerful CEO who owned the sprawling business empire. No, today he was just another face in the crowd. A faceless worker. A nobody. His palms were damp as he adjusted the cheap, ill-fitting shirt he wore, nothing like the tailored suits he usually dressed in. It itched at his skin, the fabric too stiff, too uncomfortable. He hated the feeling. But it wasn't about comfort today. It was about blending in. Disappearing. The high-pitched murmur of voices, the rattle of keyboards, and the monotonous hum of machines filled the air. Every sound, every movement, seemed to amplify Henry's discomfort, as though the office itself was mocking him. He shuffled toward the copier, trying to act casual, though his insides twisted with dread. His hand hovered over the button, and he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The very same copier that, just a few years ago, he would have had a team of assistants managing for him now felt like a weight too heavy to lift. As he pressed the button, the machine churned to life with a grinding noise. The sound felt like an explosion in his mind, a brutal reminder of the fall he had suffered, from the owner of a thriving company to an invisible, forgotten cog in a machine he had once controlled. Henry glanced around, seeing the others go about their tasks with no idea of who he truly was. They didn't recognize him. They didn't see the man who had given them their jobs, their paychecks. They saw a worker, no different from the others, a pawn in a game they thought they understood. Among the employees, Clara caught his eye. She was leaning against the break room door, arms crossed as she surveyed the office with an air of superiority. Her voice rang out, sharp and unkind, as she casually addressed a few colleagues nearby. "You'd think after all this time, the new guy would at least figure out how to work the copier properly," Clara sneered, a smug smile twisting on her lips. "I mean, what's he even doing here? Must be a real disappointment to have someone so incompetent in this company." Her words cut through the air, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Henry's face burned, but he kept his gaze lowered, not daring to make eye contact. He could feel the heat of the shame creeping up from his chest to his throat, threatening to choke him. The sting of rejection felt all too familiar. It wasn't the first time he'd been made to feel small, to feel worthless, but it hurt just as much as it had when he was a young black boy, struggling to prove his worth in a world that was always ready to dismiss him. He knew what it was like to be disregarded, to be cast aside by the world. This was nothing new. Still, the bitterness burned in his mouth, a sharp reminder of how easily the world could strip him of everything he had worked so hard for. His chest tightened, but he didn't let it show. Not here. Not now. He walked back to his desk, trying to ignore the whispers that followed him. He had long since learned the cruel nature of office politics. Clara and her friends would think nothing of making him their punching bag. But he wasn't going to let it break him, not now. He had endured worse. Much worse. As he sat at his desk, pretending to focus on the screen in front of him, he could feel their eyes on him. He heard the faint laughter of a few of the employees, the dismissive mutters. One voice in particular rose above the others. "You'd think someone in his position would at least have some basic competence," said Darren, a middle manager who looked down on everyone below him. His tone was mocking, filled with false sympathy. The words stung, but Henry refused to let them shake him. He sat in silence, fingers hovering over the keyboard. His mind wasn't on the work. It was on the feeling of being invisible, of being nothing. His thoughts drifted to the years of struggle, the sacrifices he had made to build his company. All that hard work, all that ambition, only to be reduced to this. To this humiliating, dehumanizing moment. The low murmur of voices seemed to get louder, the laughter sharper, as Clara sauntered past him again, glancing at his screen with a look of disdain. "You know," she said loud enough for him to hear, "it's embarrassing how many people like him think they can just walk in here and play business. They think they can be a part of something bigger, but they're just nothing." Henry's heart raced as the words hit like daggers. He wanted to yell, to stand up, to reveal himself for who he truly was. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he clenched his fists under the desk, forcing himself to stay still. To endure it. It was almost surreal. The humiliation he was feeling was nothing compared to the power he once had. He was the one who built this company. He was the one who had made them all what they were. Yet now, he was nothing more than a joke. A shadow in the background, watched and laughed at. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a fire began to stir. Something was awakening in him. This humiliation, this treatment, it would not define him. As Clara continued to walk past him, laughing with her friends, Henry's mind shifted. No one in this room knew who he really was. No one had any idea of the man behind the facade. That would change. Soon. The office air felt thick with tension. Henry's eyes flicked to the clock. It had only been 2 hours since he'd stepped into the building that was once his empire, but it felt like an eternity. The hum of the air conditioning was barely audible over the laughter and whispers of the employees, who seemed to forget that he, too, was an essential part of this company, even if they couldn't see it. Henry wasn't used to being invisible. Not in this way. He had worked so hard to get to where he was, fought through every obstacle, every door slammed in his face, every word of doubt spoken because of the color of his skin. But here, in this office, his name held no weight. His legacy was nothing but a distant memory to those around him. His face, his presence, was just another employee's, no different from anyone else. It wasn't the first time he had faced humiliation because of the color of his skin, but today it felt sharper. Today, there was no way to escape the sting of their words. The casual racism, the unspoken discrimination, all of it, it was here. It was in the way they dismissed him with barely a second glance. The way Clara, in particular, spoke about him as if he were a nonentity. But Henry held his ground. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. The bitterness that churned in his stomach wasn't just anger, it was strategy. He was here for a reason. The thought of exposing himself, of showing them who he truly was, lingered in his mind like a flicker of a match ready to ignite. At that moment, Clara and Darren were chatting by the water cooler. Their voices carried through the open space, too loud, too comfortable. "Honestly, I can't even believe they hired him," Clara said, eyes narrowing as she glanced toward Henry, her voice dripping with disdain. "I mean, does he really think he's gonna make it here? He doesn't even know how to work the basics." Darren chuckled, his voice mocking. "It's kind of sad, isn't it? It's like he doesn't even belong. We've got real talent here, and then there's him." Henry forced his gaze to stay fixed on his screen. Every word cut into him, but he couldn't react. He couldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. His mind drifted back to the early days when he first built this company, a young black man with nothing but ambition and a dream. He had fought every single day for a seat at the table, and now, years later, it seemed the battle was far from over. The sting of their laughter, their mockery, settled into his bones like a cold, unforgiving weight. He clenched his jaw, his fists hidden beneath the desk, but there was no space left for self-pity. No time for rage. He would endure this, and he would make them regret it. Every single one of them. The hours crawled by. The office felt like a stage where Henry was both the player and the audience, performing his role as the lowly worker while secretly holding the power of a king behind the mask of a servant. He was acutely aware of how every move he made was being observed, whether it was the way he answered a phone call or the hesitation when he was asked to fetch a simple report. Every action was met with judgment, and he could almost hear their thoughts echoing through the room. But he didn't flinch. At lunchtime, as the office emptied out into the small break room, Henry stayed at his desk. He watched from afar as Clara and Darren filled their plates with food, their conversation still a loud hum of mockery and superiority. As they spoke, Henry's mind raced through the years of struggles, through the sacrifices he had made to rise above it all. It was all for moments like this, when he could show the world what they had underestimated. Then, just as he was lost in thought, Clara's voice broke through his reverie. "I bet he doesn't even know how to make a proper coffee," she said with a laugh. "Couldn't be bothered to learn something simple." A chill ran down Henry's spine, but he swallowed it down, unwilling to let her see the effect her words had. The need to lash out, to tear into her with the fury that boiled inside him, almost overwhelmed him. But he held on. He couldn't give in. Not yet. Instead, Henry stood up slowly, as if nothing were out of the ordinary. His movements were deliberate, calm, calculated. He walked toward the break room, pausing just before the door. He knew Clara would see him, but he didn't care. The time was nearing. Clara was sitting with her back to him when he entered. As he approached the coffee machine, he could hear her voice ringing out, cutting through the idle chatter. Honestly, what did they think when they hired him? He doesn't belong here. Henry's hand paused on the coffee machine's handle. He took in a deep breath, inhaling the rich aroma of the coffee, letting it settle in his chest. The smell had always been comforting, a reminder of long nights spent working late to build something from nothing. But this was different. He wasn't the worker, the nobody, anymore. The time to end the charade had come. Henry straightened his back, his shoulders broadening as he turned around to face the room. The noise of the break room seemed to fade into silence as Clara's voice faltered when she saw him. She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing, confusion flickering on her face. What are you doing?" Clara stammered, her arrogance slipping for the first time. She had no idea who he was. She had no idea what was coming. With a measured step forward, Henry removed the cheap, ill-fitting badge from his shirt, and slowly, deliberately, he pulled off his name tag. Beneath it, his true identity was hidden, a polished, well-tailored suit waiting for its rightful owner. He looked Clara directly in the eyes, his voice steady, but his presence undeniably commanding. "I'm the CEO of this company," Henry said, his words cutting through the silence of the break room. "And I'm not here to be anyone's joke." The shock on Clara's face was palpable, and in that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The break room fell into a heavy silence, as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. Clara's face was drained of color, her mouth slightly agape as she stared at Henry, who now stood before her, fully revealed. The other employees, those who had been laughing and talking moments before, had also gone silent, their eyes darting between him and Clara. It was as though the world had stopped spinning for a moment, waiting for someone to speak, to make sense of what had just happened. Henry felt the weight of their gazes, but he stood firm. He was no longer the invisible worker he had been moments ago. He was no longer the butt of Clara's jokes, or the one who would be dismissed so easily. He had taken his place, his rightful place, as the man who built this empire. The empire they all relied on. And now, they would see him for who he truly was. Clara's mouth opened and closed, as if she were trying to form words but couldn't find them. Henry didn't look at her, instead, he took a step forward, his eyes sweeping over the room. He saw the confusion in the eyes of some, the shock in the faces of others, but most of all, he saw the guilt that was written all over their faces now that they knew the truth. Darren, who had been leaning against the counter with a smug smile not long ago, was the first to recover. "Wait a second. Henry?" "As in Henry Taylor," he stammered, his voice suddenly smaller, less sure of itself. "The CEO?" Henry nodded once, slowly, as if confirming the obvious. Darren looked at him with disbelief. "You've been here this whole time, and we didn't know?" "No," Henry replied simply, his voice steady but cold. "You didn't. But you sure thought you knew enough to judge me, didn't you?" A deep silence followed, broken only by the sharp sound of Clara clearing her throat. Her face flushed with embarrassment, but she was too proud to apologize, too filled with shame to admit her mistake. I didn't mean," she trailed off, her words falling flat. Henry looked at her, his gaze calm but piercing. "You didn't mean to humiliate me? To belittle me in front of everyone? Because that's what you did. You and your friends, Darren." He turned his attention to Darren, whose discomfort was becoming increasingly apparent. "You laughed at me. You treated me like I was nothing. But I'm not nothing, Clara. And neither are you." Clara shifted on her feet, her eyes darting nervously to the floor. I didn't know," she muttered, barely audible, trying to regain her composure. But Henry was done with excuses. Henry's voice lowered, becoming sharper. "You didn't know because you never bothered to look. You never bothered to ask. You just assumed that because I wasn't wearing a suit, because I didn't carry myself with the arrogance you expect from someone like me, that I was beneath you. You forgot what it feels like to be looked down on, didn't you, Clara? To be judged by your skin, by the way you talk, by the way you move." His words hit harder than he intended, but they were true, and Clara's flushed face was the only response he needed. The room was still, and Henry could hear the nervous shifting of feet, the faint sound of someone's breath caught in their throat. The other employees, those who had been complicit in Clara's treatment of him, now shrank back, their faces a mixture of embarrassment and regret. It was too late for apologies. But Henry wasn't interested in apologies anymore. "I wasn't here to get back at you," he said, his voice now softer, but still firm. "I wasn't here to show you how wrong you were. I was here to remind myself of something." The silence in the room deepened. They hung on his every word, their eyes wide with curiosity, some of them too proud to show it, but all of them waiting to hear what he had to say. "I needed to remind myself that no matter how far you rise, no matter how much you achieve, people will always try to tear you down," Henry continued. "But it's up to you whether or not you let that define you." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the room. "I've been through more than most of you could ever imagine. I've fought for every inch of ground I've gained. I've been underestimated, rejected, and humiliated more times than I can count. But here I am. Still standing." The room was eerily quiet. Henry's voice had the power of someone who had faced immense struggles but had come out stronger on the other side. His words were a reminder that the struggle was not just in the external world, it was within, too. It was a reminder that the strength to rise above it all didn't come from the external validation of others, but from within. Clara opened her mouth again, but this time her words were lost. She couldn't take back what she had done, and Henry wasn't asking her to. He wasn't here for an apology. What mattered now was that she understood the true weight of her actions. "I'm not angry at you, Clara," Henry said, his tone finally softening. "I'm not angry at any of you. But you've all shown me something today, something that I'm grateful for." The others looked at him, confused but intrigued. "You've shown me how far I've come," Henry said, finally smiling. "You've shown me how much I've risen above the petty judgment and the ignorant remarks. I don't need to prove myself to anyone anymore. Not to any of you." Clara's face went pale, the realization dawning on her that she had not only misjudged Henry but had also underestimated him in ways she could never have imagined. Darren shifted uncomfortably, knowing that his complicity in the situation would cost him far more than he could comprehend. Henry turned to leave the break room, his decision final. "You've all learned something today. I hope you remember it." As he walked out, the office felt strangely quieter. The chatter had stopped, and the employees were left alone with their own shame. Clara and Darren stood frozen, unsure of how to move forward after everything that had transpired. But Henry had already made his exit, both physically and emotionally. He had been knocked down, humiliated, and treated like nothing. But in the end, it was not the judgment of others that mattered. It was his own belief in himself, his understanding of his worth, that had ultimately triumphed. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The next few days after Henry's reveal were filled with a kind of tension that could only exist in a room full of secrets, pride, and regret. Word had spread quickly throughout the office. The corporate building that had once felt like a simple space of work now felt like a battleground. Everyone in the company was buzzing with shock and disbelief. No one had seen it coming. Clara, once the outspoken voice of judgment, had become a shadow of herself. She couldn't look anyone in the eye without feeling the weight of what had happened. The shame from the embarrassment of being so completely wrong, it was unbearable. She tried to salvage her dignity by acting as if nothing had changed, but the whispers around her told a different story. Henry, however, moved with an air of unbothered ease. No longer just a disguised employee, he was now the CEO, the man who had built everything, the one who signed the checks, the one who made the rules. He was a force to be reckoned with, and Clara knew it now. He had always been that force. He had simply let them underestimate him, all for the sake of this very moment. But even as Henry watched his employees squirm, there was something that gnawed at him, a feeling that hadn't quite faded. It wasn't revenge he sought. He had no interest in making anyone grovel or apologize. That would have been too easy, too beneath him. He was a man who had spent years building this company from the ground up, and now, what he wanted more than anything was respect, not just as the CEO, but as a man who had fought against odds that most would have deemed insurmountable. Henry sat in his office, watching the hustle and bustle of the company from his large window. The faces that passed by seemed so different now. They were no longer just employees, they were people who had crossed him, who had failed to see him for who he was. And yet, there was something strangely satisfying in knowing that they would never forget this. They would never forget the day Henry Taylor, the invisible worker, stood up and showed them who he truly was. His phone buzzed on his desk. It was a message from Darren. Henry almost laughed when he saw the name flash on the screen. Darren had tried to reach out several times, but Henry had deliberately ignored his calls. Now, Darren was begging for a chance to talk, to explain himself. Henry didn't need an explanation. He already knew everything he needed to know. Darren was no different from Clara. He thought that because of his position, he had the right to look down on others. That sense of entitlement, that false superiority, was something Henry had seen time and time again. He opened the message, his eyes scanning the text quickly. "Mr. Taylor, I'm really sorry. I never meant to offend you. Please, let's talk. I want to make things right. Can we meet? I promise I'm not the same person I was before." A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at Henry's lips as he read the message. Make things right? Henry thought to himself, a soft chuckle escaping his throat. It's too late for that. But still, he wasn't angry. He wasn't even bitter. He had learned long ago that there was no point in holding on to anger. In his years of struggle, he had discovered that forgiveness was the true power. Not revenge. Not humiliation. Forgiveness was the hardest thing to offer, and yet, it was the one thing that could set him free. And that was exactly what he was going to do. Later that afternoon, Henry called Clara into his office. He had made his decision. It wasn't about confronting her, or making her beg for forgiveness. No, it was about something else entirely. When Clara entered, she seemed smaller than usual, her movements stiff. Henry could see the weight of the guilt she carried with her, but he wasn't interested in making her feel worse. He had no desire to see her grovel. "Sit down, Clara," he said, his tone calm but firm. Clara hesitated but took a seat across from him. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and she stared at the floor, too ashamed to meet his gaze. Henry had never seen her so vulnerable before. "Clara," he started slowly, leaning forward in his chair, "you've made mistakes. We all make them. But the difference between you and me is that I've learned from mine. I've faced them head-on, even when it felt impossible to do so." She remained silent, but Henry could tell she was hanging on every word. "I'm not angry with you," he continued. "I don't hold grudges, and I don't believe in keeping people around who can't learn from their mistakes. What I do believe in is growth. in the opportunity to change. You have that chance, Clara. You've been given an opportunity to learn a very important lesson. And I hope you take it to heart. Clara's eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't speak. Henry could see the internal struggle in her. She wanted to apologize, to take everything back, but she couldn't. The guilt was too overwhelming. You don't need to apologize to me, Henry said quietly, his voice softening. You need to change. You need to look at people for who they are, not for what you assume them to be. Because you never know who might be watching, who might be silently judging your behavior the way you've judged me. The silence between them was thick with emotion, but Henry didn't push. He didn't need her to say anything. He just needed her to understand. I've worked too hard to let your behavior define me. But I can't stop you from defining yourself, he finished. Clara blinked back tears, her face a mixture of relief and sorrow. I understand, she whispered. She stood up slowly, her hands still shaking, and left the office without saying another word. Henry leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. The weight that had been on his chest was finally lifting. He had faced them, Clara, Darren, and the rest, and instead of seeking revenge, he had given them a chance for redemption. Whether or not they took it was up to them. But Henry knew that, for him, this was the final step. The culmination of everything he had worked for. Now, all he had to do was watch and wait. Watch to see who would rise, and who would fall. The weeks following Henry's reveal were filled with an unexpected calm. On the surface, things at the company had returned to some form of normality. But beneath the surface, there was a quiet storm brewing, one that Henry had not fully anticipated. His decision to forgive Clara and Darren, to give them a chance to learn and change, had set something in motion that neither he nor they had expected. Clara, despite her tears and promises, began to unravel in ways that Henry had not foreseen. She became more withdrawn, unable to look anyone in the eye, including the higher-ups she had once charmed with her arrogance. She stopped attending meetings, and her performance at work began to deteriorate. The once confident, calculating woman who had thought herself untouchable was now a shell of her former self. Every day, Henry saw her less and less in the office, her absence growing more noticeable with each passing day. But for all her personal struggles, Clara was not the only one affected by the ripple of Henry's revelation. Darren, too, was struggling, though in a different way. As the head of operations, he had spent years building a reputation for being clever, savvy, and always in control. However, now that Henry was openly in charge, Darren found himself questioning everything: his career, his place in the company, and his worth. Darren had spent so much time building himself up by putting others down that he couldn't handle the fact that Henry, someone he had dismissed as just another worker, had outgrown him in every way possible. He wanted to go to Henry, to talk it out, to beg for a second chance. But deep down, he knew that it was no longer about redemption. It was about something much more profound. Henry had already moved beyond the need for petty office politics and power plays. He was a man who had experienced rejection, humiliation, and betrayal, but he had transcended those feelings. He had built his empire not just with his business acumen, but with an understanding of people, how they worked, how they hurt, and how they could heal. But Henry wasn't blind to what was happening around him. He saw the shifts in his colleagues, the unease that lingered in the hallways. And he knew that a storm was coming, one that had less to do with him and more to do with the foundation of the company. One afternoon, Henry called a company-wide meeting. He had been keeping a close eye on things, and he knew that change was necessary. It wasn't just the employees he needed to address, it was the structure of the business itself. As employees filled into the large conference room, murmurs spread like wildfire. They were all eager to see what Henry would do next. Would he give another speech? Would he continue to play the role of the benevolent CEO who forgave? Would he make an example of Clara or Darren? Henry stood at the head of the room, his calm presence immediately stilling the crowd. He wasn't here for a dramatic speech, but for something more urgent. As everyone took their seats, Henry glanced at his watch before speaking. "Thank you all for joining me," he began, his voice steady, measured. I've been watching and listening to what's been happening in the company over the past few weeks, and I've made some decisions. He paused, scanning the room, his eyes briefly landing on Clara, who was sitting in the back, trying to hide in the shadows. She had become a quiet observer in the company, avoiding all confrontation but always present, hoping for some sign of redemption. I've seen some of you rise to the occasion, Henry continued, his tone warm but firm. You've shown growth, understanding, and, most importantly, respect. But there are others who have failed to take responsibility for their actions. And that is something I will not tolerate in this company. He looked directly at Darren now, who sat rigidly in his seat. Darren shifted uncomfortably under Henry's gaze, as if he could feel the weight of the CEO's words pressing down on him. Henry knew that Darren, too, had been expecting some kind of grace, but this wasn't about grace anymore. This was about integrity, about living up to the expectations that Henry had set for himself and for the company. Darren, Henry said, addressing him by name. I know you've been struggling with my presence here. You don't know how to navigate a company where the man at the top doesn't fit the mold you've built in your head. But your discomfort, your insecurities, those are your problems, not mine. I won't sacrifice the integrity of this business for your ego. The room was still. No one dared to make a sound. I'm giving you a choice, Darren, Henry continued, his voice cold. You can either start contributing to this company in a meaningful way, putting aside your prejudices and your past mistakes, or you can leave. I won't allow someone to remain in this company who cannot accept their own failings and grow from them. The choice is yours. Darren's face went pale, the weight of Henry's words sinking in. He had been offered an ultimatum, one he couldn't ignore. He had spent so many years living in a bubble of false superiority, but now, that bubble had burst. He had nowhere left to hide. Henry turned away from Darren and addressed the entire room once more. I want all of you to take a long, hard look at yourselves. Reflect on who you are, who you've been, and what you're willing to become. You've been given an opportunity to prove yourselves, to rise above the petty games, the lies, the insults, and the egos. But that is a choice only you can make. There was a deep pause as Henry let his words sink in. He knew this was the turning point, the final opportunity for his employees to change. But as he spoke, Henry's mind lingered on one thing: the true power in his life wasn't in the company or in the people who had wronged him. It was in his ability to overcome. To rise above the expectations, the humiliation, and the hurt. He had reached a point where nothing at all, could define him but himself. I'm not here to save anyone, he finished. I'm here to run a business. But if you choose to remain in this business, then we will do it the right way. We will do it together. As Henry walked out of the room, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The storm was coming, but he was ready. The company would either rise or fall based on its ability to learn, to evolve. And Henry was ready for whatever came next. The days following Henry's ultimatum were filled with mixed emotions. Clara, still reeling from her humiliation, kept to herself in the office, her performance steadily declining. But there was something else in the air, something more palpable. A shift had begun, not just in Clara but in the very foundation of the company. Henry's confrontation had created a space for change, one that no one, including himself, could have predicted. As the days passed, Darren's decision to change became more apparent. The man who once exuded arrogance was now a quieter, more introspective version of himself. He no longer strutted through the office, puffing himself up with authority. Instead, he quietly spoke with the employees who once feared him, offering advice, asking for their input, and admitting when he didn't know something. There was no longer a need to belittle others to prove his worth. He was, at long last, trying to earn back the respect he had so casually discarded. Still, Henry kept his distance, choosing not to step in too heavily. He allowed his employees to navigate the changes themselves, giving them the room to grow, to learn from their mistakes. His role, as he had always believed, was not to control them but to guide them, to show them the strength and vulnerability and the power of transformation. But despite the growth that was taking place, there was one last test: the employees themselves. They had seen Henry not as a leader but as a peer, someone they could take advantage of. But now, with his presence no longer hidden, they were faced with an uncomfortable truth. Henry had always known exactly who they were, and he had been watching, waiting for them to choose who they would become. It wasn't just Clara or Darren who were impacted by Henry's reveal. It was everyone in the company. Whispers had spread like wildfire. The employees who had once looked at Henry as an invisible figure beneath them, now saw him as someone who could not be ignored. No longer just the man who signed their paychecks, Henry had become a figure who could not be underestimated. Then, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Henry called another company-wide meeting. He had been holding off on this moment, but it was clear now that it was time to bring things to a close. He had given his employees time to reflect, time to prove themselves, and now the decisions had to be made. As the employees gathered in the conference room, there was a charged atmosphere in the air. The faces were a mixture of nervousness, curiosity, and anticipation. No one knew exactly what Henry was going to say, but they all knew it was going to be important. Henry walked into the room with the same quiet confidence he had worn since the day he had been just another worker in the office. His presence commanded attention, not through force, but through the aura of someone who had seen it all and had come out the other side stronger for it. He began without hesitation, his voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of his leadership. I gave you all a chance to show who you truly are. To reflect on your actions, to learn, to evolve. I've seen some of you take that opportunity, and I respect that. But there are still others who haven't changed. Who haven't faced the truth about themselves, and who continue to live in a cycle of deceit, power games, and arrogance. He let the words settle into the room, his gaze sweeping over the employees. Everyone was paying attention now. Clara's face had gone pale, and Darren, though standing tall, looked as though he could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. I told you before that this company would be defined by the choices you make, Henry continued. And now it's time for the next step. If you truly want to be part of this company, then you need to understand what that means. It's not about titles. It's not about power. It's about respect, respect for each other, for the work we do, and for the future we're building together. Henry paused, his eyes meeting each of theirs. He had spoken to Clara, Darren, and the others as individuals. But now, he was speaking to them as a collective. This is your last chance, he said. To be part of something bigger than yourself. To rise above the petty games, the egos, and the insecurities. I'm not asking for perfection, but I am asking for commitment. For growth. For honesty. The room was silent. Clara and Darren exchanged glances, both feeling the weight of the moment. It was clear to them now, Henry wasn't interested in punishing anyone. He was offering something far more powerful, a chance to be part of something meaningful, something that mattered. Henry turned to leave, but before he did, he added one final statement. I will no longer tolerate mediocrity. If you choose to stay, you will work with integrity, or you will leave. The choice is yours. With that, Henry walked out, leaving his employees to consider the gravity of his words. It was in that silence that the real transformation began. Clara, who had been on the edge of quitting, found herself questioning everything. She had been given the tools to change, but she had never taken them. Now, she wasn't sure if she was ready to leave the comfort of her old ways or to face the discomfort of true growth. The decision was hers to make. Darren, too, faced his own reckoning. The man who had been consumed by power and pride now found himself in a position where the only way forward was to confront his own inadequacies. He had to decide whether he would truly work alongside his colleagues or continue to sabotage his own potential. As for Henry, he knew that his role was no longer just to lead the company but to challenge each person to grow beyond their limits. He had been tested by his own decisions, tested by the people around him. But in the end, he had learned that true leadership wasn't about keeping control. It was about creating a space for others to rise, to become the best versions of themselves. Henry didn't need to prove anything anymore. His actions, his decisions, and his strength had already done that. And now, his employees would have to choose for themselves, whether to live up to the man he had revealed himself to be or fall back into the patterns of arrogance and pride they had once clung to. The company, now at a crossroads, would never be the same. But Henry was confident that whatever happened next, it would be a reflection of the choices made that day. And for the first time in a long while, Henry felt at peace. His journey wasn't just about survival or revenge, it was about transcendence. He had come to know his worth, and he knew that was enough. The rest was up to them.